Hi, this is Bob Harrington on theheart.org and Medscape Cardiology. We're going to tackle a topic today which has gotten a lot of interest in both the medical literature as well as the lay press over the course of the last few years, and that's the topic of big data. Now, it's become a phrase that's perhaps used more than it's understood, and in cardiovascular medicine, I think that's especially true. People are trying to figure out, everyone's talking about big data, but what actually is it, and how is it going to help inform what we do in science, and how is it going to help us inform what we do in clinical practice? It deals with the subject of genomics. It deals with the subject of the other omics, metabolomics, proteomics, etc. It also deals with issues of trying to define a population. And as we move from a medical care delivery system of fee-for-service to a medical care delivery system largely thinking about population health, our ability to utilize data to inform decision-making is going to become increasingly critical. So today I am really pleased to have a friend and colleague from Stanford join me here for this conversation. Dr. Euan Ashley is a cardiologist at Stanford. He's an associate professor of medicine in the Division of Cardiovascular Medicine. And for the purpose of this discussion, maybe most importantly, he's the director of the Stanford Big Data and Biomedicine Initiative. Euan, thanks for joining us here today on Medscape Cardiology.
Thanks for having me, Bob. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Euan, as I said in my intro remarks, people talk about big data, but we get a lot of different views about what it actually means. And you are the director, as I said, of our local Big Data and Biomedicine Initiative. Define for our listening audience what you think about in the context of cardiovascular medicine, health science, what you're thinking about when you think about the phrase big data.
Well, yeah, I think that's the most common question that we get asked, and there are almost as many definitions of big data as there are, I think, data points in some of these data sets. There's a few that I like. I mean, one is in particular, big data is just any data that's bigger than what you're used to dealing with. You know, and some people say big data is anything that doesn't fit in an Excel spreadsheet. Probably the most common definition that's out there is one that is called the 3 V's. That big data is defined by a large amount of volume, a large velocity of data coming at you fast, and a large variety of data. And that's an attractive definition because it starts to get at the issue. But actually, I think for most people, they have a sense of what big data is from the technology world, and they deal with it actually every day. For example, if you log on to Amazon and you start to put something in your cart, and it starts to suggest a bunch of other things that you might want to buy because other people have bought those things when we've also purchased the item in your cart, then actually what's going on behind the scenes is big data. It's basically taking large amounts of, in that case, clicks, large amounts of data about individual people and what they purchased, and making predictions about what they might want to purchase in the future. The Netflix does the same in recommending movies that you might like to watch. And I think even one of the best examples is the fraud detection on our credit cards. If you more recently, I was trying to buy a gift for my brother who lives back home in Scotland, and I went online and put my credit card in and ordered this from him in Scotland, and almost immediately I got a text message from Chase, my credit card provider, saying, "Hey, did you mean to do that? This is not like your normal pattern of purchasing." And so the technology that goes behind that, I think, is for me the most intuitive definition of big data. It's taking large amounts of data and allowing the computer to learn what's normal and to learn from it. But you also asked, I think, about cardiovascular medicine, and so I think that's very important. You know, where can we use data there? And I think that we could talk a bit about the variety of ways into the use of big data within cardiovascular medicine.
That's something we're going to come back to. We're going to come back to talk both about cardiovascular science and the practice of clinical medicine. But I want to first just pause for a minute and reflect on what you said. Netflix, Amazon, something that many of us use, you know, at least weekly, if not every day. And I love what you said about it's machine learning. It's that there is, through the accumulation of this data, it's not just static. It's not sitting there waiting for you to pull it out in the way that we used to think about things like a structured database, where the only way to retrieve the information is for you to ask a question in a certain sort of way that was structured in a way that organizationally the data could be then extracted and provide you with an answer. That's much different. I mean, the fact that you're ordering a movie, let's say it's a mystery, and then next time you log into Netflix it says you might also like. That's pretty sophisticated from a computing perspective.
Yeah, and I think that it's really a game changer in many ways. And I mean, in some ways it's not so different from what's been done before. And I mean, our statistical colleagues have been thinking about predictive analytics for a while. But I think you put your finger right on it. The difference with the new approach and where machine learning really stands out is, first of all, that it is a bit more dependent on having these very large data sets. But the computer is actually learning the patterns in a way that isn't prescribed up front. And so I think that the key there, and the really interesting thing, is that it can pick out patterns that we wouldn't otherwise be able to guess. And so being surprised by a pattern is, I think, something that is new and is something that is relatively unique to a big data world.
I like that, and I agree with you. I mean, I'm always cautioning particularly young people who are starting to do research using large amounts of information to tell them, look, you've got to be agnostic to what the answers are going to be here and agnostic to what the potential outputs are, because we all bring our biases to the table, but in this new world with huge amounts of information, you've got to be a bit more agnostic about what you expect and be willing to say, that's interesting. What can I learn from that? What else might I ask?
Yeah, I think this is exactly that. And the contrast with a very traditional approach that we see commonly in basic science, where you're almost forced to bring a hypothesis to the table and say, I think it really has to be in this direction, or I really think it's this molecule, so I'm going to test this one molecule, and now I'm going to move on to the other one. I think we have this analogy now where you can, as you say, come to the question without bias and ask what pattern that you see within the data. And then now later, of course, you can then test that hypothesis and make sure the relationship you find is causal. But in order to discover it, you can use the power of the computer and the power that goes beyond any pattern you, as a human, could pick up to find patterns that otherwise would not be discovered.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that we're not advocating the discarding of hypothesis-based science, but rather we're saying that this is another way of doing science that is complementary to hypothesis-based science. Is that a fair statement?
No, I think so, exactly. I mean, I look at it this way, that if you only have a certain number of years of your life, a certain amount of time on this earth to test things, and if you can be smarter about choosing the things that you test, then that can only be good. And I think big data can really help you be smart about stacking the dice in your favor when it comes to doing that experiment.
So before we start talking about cardiovascular science, cardiovascular practice, let's reflect for a couple of minutes, Euan, on you and your role. You're a cardiologist, as I said. You specialize in taking care of patients with heart failure. How did you get into this world of big data, and how did you come to play the role at Stanford of overseeing the Big Data and Biomedicine Initiative?
Yeah, well, great question. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I often say that I was born a geek but trained as a cardiologist. And so I think that this is, as a kid growing up, I was into computers probably more than I should have been. I mean, I like to go outside and play sport too, but I was often inside programming computers. I wrote a tax program for my dad, believe it or not, when I was about 14. So a kind of uber geek growing up. And
yeah, good kid to have around the house, that's for sure.
Right. You know, the challenge was they changed the tax code the next year, so my whole computer program became defunct the next year.
Yeah, not a good business model.
No, I learned early about upgrade cycles. So so I mean, I've always been interested in data and data science, and before there was ever the phrase big data, I just certainly loved computers and gadgets, and so that's part, I think, of what drove me towards cardiology. I mean, I think as cardiologists, we're partly technologists. We love the technology, and we love to see what that can do for our patients. And so when I learned genetics, I did my PhD in Oxford, and at that point I learned genetics. And so genetics at that point was still pretty low throughput. We were doing PCR reactions of amplifying a single gene. But it was changing. It just began to change, and it changed in large part because of technology that much of which came from around where we are here in Silicon Valley, biotechnology companies that started to say, well, look, if you can measure, the microarray was the first one. Why just measure 1, 2, 10 gene expression measurements at once? If you could, wouldn't it be better to measure 400 or 500? And so the microarray was born, and from that, really a whole world of high throughput science was created, and starting, of course, with gene expression, but moving rapidly towards Illumina was one of the companies that pushed the envelope in terms of gene chips, along with Affymetrix, and then later they took on the world of gene sequencing. And in particular, we went from a world where it cost $3 billion, the Human Genome Project was funded for at the beginning, and of which probably $500 million was spent actually sequencing one genome, to a day today when you can sequence a genome for $1,000. And so I think the world was irrevocably changing around me, and I realized that having an interest in computers and statistics and data science was actually something that was going to be very relevant for medicine, whereas it had originally started as a hobby. And I think so it became a very natural fit. I got very involved in genomics and sequencing and building algorithms for interpreting the human genome. And I think that grabbed the attention of our dean, and he hauled me up one day and said, I need you to do something for me.
You're also being a little modest. I mean, you led the team that really put the clinical interpretation around a single human genome. And you want to talk a little bit about that, how that came to be, and because that was a seminal piece of work that now we look back at as is really maybe changing an era.
Well, you're very kind. I mean, that was really a big team effort, and it came out, in fact, interestingly, of a conversation I had with one of our chairs of bioengineering at the time, Steve Quake, and he was the 5th person in the world to have sequenced his genome. And so back then, there really were only 5 or 10 people whose genomes had ever been sequenced, and he was the 5th. And he was showing me some of the data one day, and he was pointing out some gene variants, and in particular, he showed one that is familiar to me as a physician who looks after patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It was a variant in myosin binding protein C, which is a gene that is commonly the cause of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And he said, hey, what do you think of that gene? And I said, well, I know that gene quite well. And so I started asking a cardiovascular family history. And he, as usual, couldn't think of any at first. And then before I knew it, he was telling me about his dad's VT and MIs in his family, and a sudden death in his cousin's son. And at that point, really based on his family history alone, I invited him to be screened in our clinic. And he said, my family have been telling me to do that. As a 40-year-old man, he'd never really seen a doctor or had a lipid panel even. And so he was suddenly walking into our clinic here at Stanford as probably the first patient ever to have a genome like in his back pocket, which was really just a remarkable thing, but also a little bit scary, because here we have a patient with 6 billion data points that are potentially relevant to his health, and he's asking his doctor, is that useful for his care? And I think that was really the inspiration to pull together this team of Stanford and some Harvard computational biologists and physicians to try and work out what would we actually do. I mean, the price of genomes was dropping. It became clear that one day everybody was going to have their genome probably in their medical record, and that we really needed to start thinking about how we were going to deal with that. And so over the course of 6 to 12 months, we sort of down tools and all these groups just worked on this one thing. Say, how do we do that? How do we harness the genetic information that's out there to bring it to bear on a single individual's medical care? And I think it was we put it out there as I think the beginning of a chapter that is continuing and is really an exciting transformation in the way we do medicine.
So that's a great transition point that I want to get to about how you see this actually impacting how we do clinical medicine. As you say, to look at Dr. Quake's genomic sequence, you had to put a team together. and that team worked on this over 6 to 12 months. What do you think the spend of that was, Euan, in terms of financial terms? How much do you think it cost you as a team to do that? An enormous amount of computational expertise and an enormous amount of analytical power devoted to one person.
Right.
What do you think it cost?
I mean, at the time, people talked about, we might be able one day to get to the $1,000 genome, but we're going to be talking about the $1 million analysis. And so that became a kind of catchword. I think it didn't cost $1 million, even that first one. I think we calculated it was probably 600 or 700 person hours, which is a lot. But the good news is, first of all, that was a few years ago now. The good news is it's a lot less, and we need a lot less manual labor. There still is a manual labor part involved because of the challenging and kind of multivariate nature of evidence that a variant causes a disease. That always will require some degree of human input. But a large number of those algorithms that we were building for the first time have really become established and evolved, and many groups around the world have improved them.
Give us an example of one of that might resonate with our listening audience, who are largely clinicians and who are interested in how this kind of work might impact what they're going to do, if not in their clinic today, maybe in the near future. What kind of algorithms have been created that the clinician would resonate with?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the thoughts that we had at the time, we were sort of imagining what this would look like in the future. And the first part of that is you shouldn't have to click a button and order a test and then wait a few weeks for the result to come back and then go through a PDF document of the result that's mostly text. That's kind of what happens today with genetic testing. What we were really envisaging was a situation where the genome was already there, and it was already not only present but integrated into the medical record. So I think a good analogy is the one that we currently have with drug interactions. So you have a patient in your clinic, and you're going to decide that they need a new antihypertensive, let's say, and so you make your choice, and you pull up their prescription order form on your electronic health record, and you type it in. But what happens then is, in the background, that the pharmacy module of the electronic health record is going to check that drug with the drugs that the patient is already on, and that's pretty helpful. And if there's a well-known interaction, then it's going to stick that on the screen for you just to remind you and make you click 14 times that you really meant to prescribe that before you get to it. Our hope is that in this new world that we're imagining, the algorithms will work behind the scene, and we'll look up not just the rest of the drugs the patient's on, but actually look up the patient's genome. And so they'll say, wait a minute, there's an interaction here, or this particular patient is known to metabolize clopidogrel in this case, or the prodrug for that could be a good example, could metabolize that faster. You may want to consider a higher dose or a different agent.
Yeah, and this would be the symptom if you're starting people on oral vitamin K antagonism. Might there be a way that you would tailor the dosing? Now, we know there's been clinical trials on that, and whether or not that actually improves dosing, I think, is yet to be told. But the principle is that this information would work behind the scenes to help the doctor, not necessarily to frighten the doctor into thinking that, oh, my God, this is going to take months to do.
Right, and I think that's a really, really key point you made there, Bob. I mean, I think when we ask physicians, are you interested in the area? Are you interested generally in how genetics might help you prescribe, for example? Then almost everyone says yes. If you then ask them, do you want to order a test that takes 2 weeks to come back, and we'll give you the answer,
right?
They generally say no. But if you say, if that information was already available, and as you prescribe it popped up on the screen in front of you, would you use it? Well, again, the answer is universally yes. And I think we're used to doing that as physicians, aren't we? Just pulling in whatever information we can from wherever we can get it to try to make the best individualized decision for the patient in front of us.
Yeah, I'm always saying that as clinicians, we are natural Bayesians. We love to take all of this disparate information and assess the probability of something happening. And it's always interested me, although we're natural Bayesians, much of the evidence that we have in clinical medicine is based on frequentist statistics. And so what you're describing in many ways should be highly appealing to clinicians because it appeals to the Bayesian nature of the way they think.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we're also very used to dealing with uncertainty. Without, there is no black and white answer to this, but here's a probability that this could be helpful. And I think that we integrate that information routinely as part of our everyday practice. And that, I agree absolutely.
So now let's talk a little bit about the training paradigm, because the world is changing. I mean, the way that you and I went through medical school and what we learned and how we thought about applying that to our clinical practice is now much different. I mean, our medical students now are going to have to be much more grounded in the quantitative sciences and truly understanding issues of uncertainty and probability and drawing inference than ever before. Have you been, as you're thinking about the Big Data Biomedicine Initiative, what are you thinking about from the education/training perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really important point. I think the world is not the same today as it was even 5 years ago, and the rapidity with which it is changing is much, is on a different scale from the rapidity of which we're used to changing medical curricula, for example. So I think the training component, both for people who are currently in training, for those who are just coming down the pike, and then for those of us who have trained or done our early training some time ago, I think we have to address both those needs. And it's a central component of what we're thinking about around the Biomedical Data Science Initiative at Stanford, as you mentioned. We're very lucky here because there's a significant tradition of computer science at Stanford, and a very strong bioinformatics program, a heavily oversubscribed training program that's been going for several years. So I think that we are very lucky to have a number of students around who are available to help teach and are available to go out into the world and sort of spread the word. But I think we really do need to address this. The NIH has done this recently. The NIH has a big data initiative called BD2K and has started a number of training grants that are just out right now being reviewed in order to expand the base of people that are trained in this area. But I think there needs to be change in the medical school curriculum to be able, so that our medical students are able to understand and deal with quantitative sciences in a way that they really never had to in the past.
Mentioning the NIH reminds me of the topic that I wanted to end with, which is, I think of the NIH, I think of the public investment into science, the public investment into to pushing the boundaries of clinical medicine, and it brings to mind the President Obama's State of the Union address this year, where he put forward an initiative in precision medicine. Number one, Euan, were you excited about that? Number two, did it surprise you? Number three, what is this, and do you think it really can make a difference?
Yeah, I think all really good questions. I mean, it definitely was exciting. I think for anything, however defined, that's in the field of data and personalized, individualized medicine, I think to be given that kind of platform for discussion, I think is very exciting. And those of us who work in this general area were certainly very, very happy to hear that it given that sort of a platform. It's interesting, I think the listeners would be interested that he used the term precision medicine rather than the terms that we're maybe more used to, like personalized medicine or individualized medicine. I think that comes out of a desire, I think, to emphasize the breadth of the opportunity here. So we described earlier in the conversation there some examples of personalized medicine where we could use somebody's genome to try to individualize their care. I think precision medicine has another aspect to it, which is that if we can use those kinds of tools, they could be big data tools, they could be omics tools, they could be standard clinical analyses. If we can use those tools and those kinds of analyses to understand diseases better, then we can be much more precise in our development of drugs. And I can give you an example of that. The one actually that he referred to, both in the State of the Union and in the follow-up press conference, is cystic fibrosis. And we've understood the genetic basis of cystic fibrosis for many years. It was Francis Collins, the director of the NIH himself, who was part of the team that originally found the gene for that condition, the CFTR gene. But what has happened in the recent past is that drug companies have begun to realize that we can define subpopulations of this disease that can be targeted very precisely with medications. And so in this case, there was a drug that was fast-tracked through the FDA last year called Kalydeco, which is aimed at a subset of cystic fibrosis. So it's dependent on having the genetic information about the disease present. And as the listeners will probably know, cystic fibrosis is a disease of a channel that is the CFTR channel that is either dysfunctional but within the cell, dysfunctional on the membrane. And so there's a particular subsection of the disease that is targeted by this drug. And it was fast-tracked through and has been a huge success in the market. And I think part of the inspiration for the Precision Medicine Initiative is that sort of understanding. There's examples within cardiovascular medicine too, a company called Myocardia that are starting to think about targeting inherited heart disease in a much more specific way. So I think, yes, it's very exciting. I think it is a new way of doing medicine and science, and we're very happy to have it given that sort of national platform.
Euan, this has been a fabulous discussion on big data and how it might be useful both in science as well as in clinical medicine. I want to thank you for joining us here today on Medscape Cardiology. Again, our guest today has been Dr. Euan Ashley, who is a cardiologist, an associate professor of medicine, and the director of the Stanford Big Data in Biomedicine Initiative. Euan, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Bob, thanks for having me. It's really been a pleasure.